Chapter 11 The Round of Life. Anne was back in Averil with the luster of the Thorburn scholarship on her brow. People told her she hadn't changed much, in a tone which hinted they were surprised and a little disappointed she hadn't. Averil had not changed either, at least so it seemed at first. But as Anne sat in the Green Gables pew on the first Sunday after her return, and looked over the congregation, she saw several little changes which, all coming home to her at once, made her realize that time did not quite stand still, even in Averil. A new minister was in the pulpit. In the pews more than one familiar face was missing forever. Old Uncle Abe, his prophesying over and done with, Mrs. Peter Sloane, who had sighed, it was to be hoped, for the last time, Timothy Cotton, who, as Mrs. Rachel Lynde said, had actually managed to die at last after practicing at it for 20 years, and old Josiah Sloane, whom nobody knew in his coffin because he had his whiskers neatly trimmed, were all sleeping in the little graveyard behind the church. And Billy Andrews was married to Nettie Blewett. They appeared out that Sunday, when Billy, beaming with pride and happiness, showed his beplumed and besilked bride into the Harmon Andrews pew. Anne dropped her lids to hide her dancing eyes. She recalled the stormy winter night of the Christmas holidays, when Jane had proposed for Billy. He certainly had not broken his heart over his rejection. Anne wondered if Jane had also proposed to Nettie for him, or if he had mustered enough spunk to ask the fateful question himself. All the Andrews family seemed to share in his pride and pleasure, from Mrs. Harmon in the pew to Jane in the choir. Jane had resigned from the Averil school and intended to go west in the fall. "Can't get a view in Averil, that's what," said Mrs. Rachel Lynde scornfully. "Says she thinks she'll have better health out west. I never heard her health was poor before."
"Jane is a nice girl," Anne had said loyally. "She never tried to attract attention as some did."
"Oh, she never chased the boys, if that's what you mean," said Mrs. Rachel. "But she liked to be married just as much as anybody, that's what. What else would take her out west to some forsaken place whose only recommendation is that men are plenty and women scarce? Don't you tell me." But it was not at Jane Anne gazed that day in dismay and surprise. It was at Ruby Gillis, who sat beside her in the choir. What had happened to Ruby? She was even handsomer than ever, but her blue eyes were too bright and lustrous, and the color of her cheeks was hectically brilliant. Besides, she was very thin. The hands that held her hymn book were almost transparent in their delicacy.
"Is Ruby Gillis ill?"
Anne asked of Mrs. Lynde as they went home from church. "Ruby Gillis is dying of galloping consumption," said Mrs. Lynde bluntly. "Everybody knows it except herself and her family. They won't give in. If you ask them, she's perfectly well. She hasn't been able to teach since she had that attack of congestion in the winter. But she says she's going to teach again in the fall, and she's after the White Sands School. She'll be in her grave, poor girl, when White Sands School opens, that's what." Anne listened in shocked silence. Ruby Gillis, her old school chum, dying? Could it be possible? Of late years they had grown apart, but the old tie of schoolgirl intimacy was there and made itself felt sharply in the tug the news gave at Anne's heartstrings. Ruby, the brilliant, the merry, the coquettish. It was impossible to associate the thought of her with anything like death. She had greeted Anne with gay cordiality after church, and urged her to come up the next evening.
"I'll be away Tuesday and Wednesday evenings,"
she had whispered triumphantly.
"There's a concert comedy and a party at White Sands. Herb Spencer's going to take me. He's my latest. Be sure to come up tomorrow. I'm dying for a good talk with you. I want to hear all about your doings at Redmond.
Anne knew that Ruby meant that she wanted to tell Anne all about her own recent flirtations, but she promised to go, and Diana offered to go with her. I've been wanting to go see Ruby for a long while, she told Anne when they left Green Gables the next evening. But I really couldn't go alone. It's so awful to hear Ruby rattling on as she does, and pretending there's nothing the matter with her, even when she can hardly speak for coughing. She's fighting so hard for her life, and yet she hasn't any chance at all, they say. What a beautiful sunset, said Diana. Look, Anne, it's just like a land in itself, isn't it? That long, low back of purple cloud is the shore, and the clear sky further on is like a golden sea. If we could sail to it in the moonshine boat Paul wrote of in his old composition, you remember? How nice it would be, said Anne, rousing from her reverie. Do you think we could find all our yesterdays there, Diana? All our old springs and blossoms? The beds of flowers that Paul saw there are the roses that have bloomed for us in the past. Don't, said Diana. You make me feel as if we were old women with everything in life behind us.
I think I've almost felt as if we were since I heard about poor Ruby, said Anne. If it is true that she is dying, any other sad thing might be true too. You don't mind calling in at Alicia Wright's for a moment, do you? Asked Diana. Mother asked me to leave this little dish of jelly for Aunt Atossa. Who is Aunt Atossa? Oh, haven't you heard? She's Mrs. Samson Coates of Spencer Vale, Mrs. Alicia Wright's aunt. She's father's aunt too. Her husband died last winter and she was left very poor and lonely, so the Wrights took her to live with them. Mother thought we ought to take her, but father put his foot down. Live with Aunt Atossa he would not. Is she so terrible? Asked Anne absently. You'll probably see what she's like before we can get away, said Diana significantly. Father says she has a face like a hatchet. It cuts the air, but her tongue is sharper still. Late as it was, Aunt Atossa was cutting potato sets in the Wright kitchen. She wore a faded old wrapper, and her gray hair was decidedly untidy. Aunt Atossa did not like being caught in a kilter, so she went out of her way to be disagreeable. Oh, so you're Anne Shirley, she said when Diana introduced Anne. I've heard of you. Her tone implied that she had heard nothing good. Mrs. Andrews was telling me you were home. She said you had improved a good deal. There was no doubt Aunt Atossa thought there was plenty of room for further improvement. She ceased not from cutting sets with much energy. Is it any use to ask you to sit down? She inquired sarcastically. Of course there's nothing very entertaining here for you. The rest are all away. Mother sent you this little pot of rhubarb jelly, said Diana pleasantly. She made it today and thought you might like some. Oh, thanks, said Aunt Atossa sourly. I never fancy your mother's jelly. She always makes it too sweet. However, I'll try to worry some down. My appetite's been dreadful poor this spring. I'm far from well, continued Aunt Atossa solemnly, but still I keep a-doing. People who can't work aren't wanted here. If it isn't too much trouble, will you be condescending enough to set the jelly in the pantry? I am in a hurry to get these spuds done tonight. I suppose you two ladies never do anything like this. You'd be afraid of spoiling your hands. I used to cut potato sets before we rented the farm, smiled Anne. I do it yet, laughed Diana. I cut sets 3 days last week, of course. she added teasingly. I did my hands up in lemon juice and kid gloves every night after it.
Aunt Atossa sniffed. I suppose you got that notion out of some of those silly magazines you read so many of. I wonder your mother allows you, but she always spoiled you. We all thought when George married her she wouldn't be a suitable wife for him. Aunt Atossa sighed heavily as if all forebodings upon the occasion of George Barry's marriage had been amply and darkly fulfilled. Going, are you? She inquired as the girls rose. Well, I suppose you can't find much amusement talking to an old woman like me. It's such a pity boys ain't home.
We want to run in and see Ruby Gillis a little while, explained Diana.
Oh, anything does, for an excuse, of course, said Aunt Atossa amiably. Just whip in and whip out before you have time to say how do decently. It's college airs, I suppose. You'd be wiser to keep away from Ruby Gillis. The doctors say consumption's catching. I always knew Ruby'd get something gadding off to Boston last fall for a visit. People who ain't content to stay home always catch something.
People who don't go visiting catch things too. Sometimes they even die, said Diana solemnly.
Then they don't have themselves to blame for it, retorted Aunt Atossa triumphantly. I hear you are to be married in June, Diana.
There's no truth in that report, said Diana, blushing.
Well, don't put it off too long, said Aunt Atossa significantly. You'll fade soon, your old complexion and hair, and the rides are terrible fickle. You ought to wear a hat, Miss Shirley. Your nose is freckling scandalous. My, but you are red-headed. Well, I suppose we're all as the Lord made us. Give Marilla Cuthbert my respects. She never been to see me since I came to Avonlea, but I suppose I oughtn't to complain. The Cuthberts always did think themselves a cut higher than anyone else round here.
Oh, isn't she dreadful? Gasped Diana as they escaped down the lane. She's worse than Miss Eliza Andrews, said Anne. But then think of living all your life with a name like Atossa. Wouldn't it sour almost anyone? She should have tried to imagine her name was Cordelia. It might have helped her a great deal. It certainly helped me in the days when I didn't like Anne.
Josie Pye will be just like her when she grows up, said Diana. Josie's mother and Aunt Atossa are cousins, you know. Oh dear, I'm glad that's over. She's so malicious. She seems to put a bad flavor in everything. Father tells such a funny story about her. One time they had a minister in Spencervale who was a very good spiritual man but very deaf. He couldn't hear any ordinary conversation at all. But one evening, Aunt Atossa bounced up. She didn't either pray or preach. Instead, she listened to everybody else in the church and gave them a fearful raking down, calling them right out by name, and telling them how they all had behaved and casting up all the quarrels and scandals of the past 10 years. Finally, she wound up by saying that she was disgusted with Spencervale Church, and she never meant to darken its doors again, and she hoped a fearful judgment would come upon it. Then she sat down out of breath, and the minister, who hadn't heard a word she said, immediately remarked in a very devout voice, "Amen. The Lord grant our dear sister's prayer." You ought to hear Father tell the story. Speaking of stories, Diana, remarked Anne in a significant confidential tone, do you know that lately I have been wondering if I could write a short story, a story that would be good enough to be published? Why, of course you could, said Diana after she had grasped the amazing suggestion. He used to write perfectly thrilling stories years ago in our old story club. Well, I hardly meant one of that kind of stories, smiled Anne. I've been thinking about it a little of late, but I'm almost afraid to try, for if I should fail, it would be too humiliating. I heard Priscilla say once that all Mrs. Morgan's first stories were rejected.
But I'm sure yours wouldn't be, Anne, for it's likely editors have more sense nowadays. Margaret Burton, one of the junior girls at Redmond, wrote a story last winter and it was published in the Canadian Woman. I really do think I could write one at least as good. And will you have it published in the Canadian Woman? I might try one of the bigger magazines first. It all depends on what kind of a story I write. What is it to be about? I don't know yet. I want to get hold of a good plot. I believe this is very necessary from an editor's point of view. The only thing I've settled on is the heroine's name. It is to be Averil Lester. Rather pretty, don't you think? Don't mention this to anyone, Diana. I haven't told anybody but you and Mr. Harrison. He wasn't very encouraging. He said there was far too much trash written nowadays as it was, and he'd expected something better of me after a year at college. What does Mr. Harrison know about it? Demanded Diana scornfully. They found the Gillis home gay with lights and callers. Leonard Kimball of Spencervale and Morgan Bell of Comedy were glaring at each other across the parlor. Several merry girls had dropped in. Ruby was dressed in white, and her eyes and cheeks were very brilliant. She laughed and chattered incessantly, and after the other girls had gone, she took Anne upstairs to display her new summer dresses.
I have a blue silk to make up yet, but it's a little heavy for summer wear. I think I'll leave it until the fall. I'm going to teach in White Sands, you know. How do you like my hat? That one you had on in church yesterday was real dinky. But I like something brighter for myself. Did you notice those two ridiculous boys downstairs? They've both come determined to sit each other out. I don't care a single bit about either of them, you know. Herb Spencer's the one I like. Sometimes I really do think he's Mr. Right. At Christmas, I thought the Spencerville schoolmaster was that, but I found out something about him that turned me against him. He nearly went insane when I turned him down. I wish those two boys hadn't come tonight. I wanted to have a nice good talk with you, Anne, and tell you such heaps of things. You and I were always good chums, weren't we?
Ruby swept her arm about Anne's waist with a shallow little laugh. But just for a moment their eyes met, and behind all the luster of Ruby's, Anne saw something that made her heart ache.
Come up often, won't you, Anne?
Whispered Ruby.
Come alone. I want you.
Are you feeling quite well, Ruby?
Me? Why, I'm perfectly well. I never felt better in my life. Of course, that congestion last winter pulled me down a little. But just see my color. I don't look much like an invalid, I'm sure.
Ruby's voice was almost sharp. She pulled her arm away from Anne as if in resentment and ran downstairs, where she was gayer than ever, apparently so much absorbed in bantering her two swains that Diana and Anne felt rather out of it and soon went away. Chapter 12. Averil's Atonement. What are you dreaming of, Anne? The two girls were loitering one evening in the fairy hollow of the brook. Ferns nodded in it, and little grasses were green, and wild pears hung finely scented white curtains around it. Anne roused herself from her reverie with a happy sigh.
I was thinking out my story, Diana.
Oh, have you really begun it? Cried Diana, all alight with eager interest in a moment.
Yes, I have only a few pages written, but I have it all pretty well thought out. I've had such a time to get a suitable plot. None of the plots that suggested themselves suited a girl named Averil.
Couldn't you have changed her name?
No, the thing was impossible. I tried to, but I couldn't do it, any more than I could change yours. Averil was so real to me that no matter what other name I tried to give her, I just thought of her as Averil behind it all.
but finally I got a plot that matched her. Then came the excitement of choosing names for all my characters. You have no idea how fascinating that is. I've lain awake for hours thinking over those names. The hero's name is Percival Dalrymple.
Have you named all the characters? Asked Diana wistfully. If you hadn't, I was going to ask you to let me name one, just some unimportant person. I'd feel as if I had a share in the story then.
You may name the little hired boy who lived with the Lesters,
conceded Anne.
He's not very important, but he is the only one left unnamed.
Call him Raymond Fitzosborne, suggested Diana, who had a store of such names laid away in her memory, relics of the old story club, which she and Anne and Jane Andrews and Ruby Gillis had had in their school days. Anne shook her head doubtfully.
I'm afraid that is too aristocratic a name for a chore boy, Diana. I couldn't imagine a Fitzosborne feeding pigs and picking up chips, could you?
Diana didn't see why, if you had an imagination at all, you couldn't stretch it to that extent. But probably Anne knew best, and the chore boy was finally christened Robert Ray, to be called Bobby should occasion require. How much do you suppose you'll get for it? Asked Diana. But Anne had not thought about this at all. She was in pursuit of fame, not filthy lucre, and her literary dreams were as yet untainted by mercenary considerations. You'll let me read it, won't you? Pleaded Diana.
When it is finished, I'll read it to you and Mr. Harrison, and I shall want you to criticize it severely. No one shall see it until it is published.
How are you going to end it? Happily or unhappily?
I'm not sure. I like to end unhappily because that would be so much more romantic. But I understand editors have a prejudice against sad endings. I heard Professor Hamilton say once that nobody but a genius should try to write an unhappy ending, and
concluded Anne modestly.
I'm anything but a genius.
Oh, I like happy endings best. You'd better let him marry her, said Diana, who, especially since her engagement to Fred, thought this was how every story should end.
But you like to cry over stories?
Oh, yes, in the middle of them, but I like everything to come right at last.
I must have one pathetic scene in it,
said Anne thoughtfully.
I might let Robert Ray be injured in an accident and have a death scene.
No, you mustn't kill Bobby off, declared Diana, laughing. He belongs to me, and I want him to live and flourish. Kill somebody else if you have to. For the next fortnight, Anne writhed, or revelled, according to mood, in her literary pursuits. Now she would be jubilant over a brilliant idea, now despairing because some contrary character would not behave properly. Diana could not understand this. Make them do as you want them to, she said.
I can't,
mourned Anne.
Averil is such an unmanageable heroine. She will do and say things I never meant her to. Then that spoils everything that went before, and I have to write it all over again.
Finally, however, the story was finished, and Anne read it to Diana in the seclusion of the porch gable. She had achieved her pathetic scene without sacrificing Robert Ray, and she kept a watchful eye on Diana as she read it. Diana rose to the occasion and cried properly. But when the end came, she looked a little disappointed. "Why did you kill Maurice Lennox?" she asked reproachfully.
"He was the villain," protested Anne. "He had to be punished."
"I like him best of them all," said unreasonable Diana.
"Well, he's dead, and he'll have to stay dead," said Anne rather resentfully. "If I had let him live, he'd have gone on persecuting Averil and Percival."
"Yes, unless you had reformed him."
"That wouldn't have been romantic, and besides, it would have made the story too long."
"Well, anyway, it's a perfectly elegant story, Anne, and will make you famous off that, I'm sure. Have you got a title for it?"
"Oh, I decided on the title long ago. I call it Averil's Atonement. Doesn't that sound nice and alliterative? Now, Diana, tell me candidly, do you see any faults in my story?"
"Well," hesitated Diana, "that part where Averil makes the cake doesn't seem to me quite romantic enough to match the rest. It's just what anybody might do. Heroines shouldn't do cooking, I think."
"Why, that is where the humor comes in, and that's one of the best parts of the whole story,"
said Anne, and it may be stated that in this she was quite right. Diana prudently refrained from any further criticism, but Mr. Harrison was much harder to please. First he told her there was entirely too much description in the story. "Cut out all those flowery passages," he said unfeelingly. Anne had an uncomfortable conviction that Mr. Harrison was right, and she forced herself to expunge most of her beloved descriptions, though it took 3 rewritings before the story could be pruned down to please the fastidious Mr. Harrison.
"I've left out all the descriptions but the sunset," she said at last. "I simply couldn't let it go. It was the best of them all."
"It hasn't anything to do with the story," said Mr. Harrison, "and you shouldn't have laid the scene among rich city people. What do you know of them? Why didn't you lay it right here in Avonlea? Changing the name, of course, or else Mrs. Rachel Lynde would probably think she was the heroine."
"Oh, that would never have done," protested Anne. "Avonlea is the dearest place in the world, but it isn't quite romantic enough for the scene of a story."
"I dare say there's been many a romance in Avonlea, and many a tragedy too," said Mr. Harrison dryly. "But your folks ain't like real folks anywhere. They talk too much and use too high-flown language. There's one place where that Dalrymple chap talks even on for 2 pages, and never lets the girl get a word in edgewise. If he'd done that in real life, she'd have pitched him."
"I don't believe it,"
said Anne flatly. In her secret soul she thought that the poetical, beautiful things said to Averil would win any girl's heart completely. Besides, it was gruesome to hear of Averil, the stately queen like Averil, pitching anyone. Averil declined her suitors. "Anyhow," resumed the merciless Mr. Harrison, "I don't see why Maurice Lennox didn't get her. He was twice the man the other is. He did bad things, but he did them. Percival hadn't time for anything but mooning."
"Mooning?"
That was even worse than pitching.
"Maurice Lennox was the villain," said Anne indignantly. "I don't see why everyone likes him better than Percival."
"Percival is too good. He's aggravating. Next time you write about a hero, put a little spice of human nature in him."
"Averil couldn't have married Maurice. He was bad."
"She'd have reformed him. You can reform a man, and you can't reform a jellyfish, of course. Your story isn't bad. It's kind of interesting, I'll admit it. But you're too young to write a story that would be worthwhile. Wait 10 years. Anne made up her mind that the next time she wrote a story, she wouldn't ask anybody to criticize it. It was too discouraging. She would not read the story to Gilbert, although she told him about it,
If it is a success, you'll see it when it is published, Gilbert. But if it is a failure, nobody shall ever see it.
Marilla knew nothing about the venture. In imagination, Anne saw herself reading a story out of a magazine of Marilla, entrapping her into praise of it, for in imagination all things are possible, and then triumphantly announcing herself the author. One day Anne took to the post office a long, bulky envelope addressed with the delightful confidence of youth and inexperience to the very biggest of the big magazines. Diana was as excited over it as Anne herself. "How long do you suppose it will be before you hear from it?" she asked.
"It shouldn't be longer than a fortnight. Oh, how happy and proud I shall be if it is accepted."
"Of course it will be accepted, and they will likely ask you to send them more. You may be as famous as Mrs. Morgan some day, Anne, and then how proud I will be of knowing you," said Diana, who possessed at least the striking merit of an unselfish admiration of the gifts and graces of her friends. A week of delightful dreaming followed, and then came a bitter awakening. One evening Diana found Anne in the porch gable with suspicious-looking eyes. On the table lay a long envelope and a crumpled manuscript. "Anne, your story hasn't come back?" cried Diana incredulously.
"Yes, it has,"
said Anne shortly. "Well, that editor must be crazy. What reason did he give?"
"No reason at all. There is just a printed slip saying that it wasn't found acceptable."
"I never thought much of that magazine anyway," said Diana hotly. "The stories in it are not half as interesting as those in the Canadian Woman, although it costs so much more. I suppose the editor is prejudiced against anyone who isn't a Yankee." "Don't be discouraged, Anne. Remember how Mrs. Morgan's stories came back? Send yours to the Canadian Woman."
"I believe I will,"
said Anne, plucking up heart.
"And if it is published, I'll send that American editor a marked copy. But I'll cut the sunset out. I believe Mr. Harrison was right."
Out came the sunset. But, in spite of this heroic mutilation, the editor of the Canadian Woman sent Averil's Atonement back so promptly that the indignant Diana declared that it couldn't have been read at all, and vowed she was going to stop her subscription immediately. Anne took this second rejection with the calmness of despair. She locked the story away in the garret trunk where the old Story Club tales reposed. But first she yielded to Diana's entreaties and gave her a copy.
"This is the end of my literary ambitions,"
she said bitterly. She never mentioned the matter to Mr. Harrison, but one evening he asked her bluntly if her story had been accepted.
"No, the editor wouldn't take it,"
she answered briefly. Mr. Harrison looked sidewise at the flushed, delicate profile. "Well, I suppose you'll keep on writing them," he said encouragingly.
"No, I shall never try to write a story again,"
declared Anne with the hopeless finality of 19 when a door is shut in its face. "I wouldn't give up altogether," said Mr. Harrison reflectively. "I'd write a story once in a while, but I wouldn't pester editors with it. I'd write of people and places like I knew, and I'd make my characters talk everyday English, and I'd let the sun rise and set in the usual quiet way without much fuss over the fact. If I had to have villains at all, I'd give them a chance, Anne. I'd give them a chance. There are some terrible bad men in the world, I suppose, but you'd have to go a long piece to find them, though Mrs. Lynde believes we're all bad. But most of us have got a little decency somewhere in us. Keep on writing, Anne."
No. It was very foolish of me to attempt it. When I'm through Redmond, I'll stick to teaching. I can teach. I can't write stories.
It'll be time for you to be getting a husband when you're through Redmond, said Mr. Harrison. I don't believe in putting marrying off too long, like I did. Anne got up and marched home. There were times when Mr. Harrison was really intolerable. Pitching, mooning, and getting a husband